In this chapter, we'll be talking about many of the things that we need to consider when selecting assessment tools specifically for special education evaluations. Amongst other things, one of the key things that we need to consider is discrimination in our assessment, which we'll talk a little bit more about this later. We have to talk about or focus on the educational needs of the child and make sure that our assessment is comprehensive as well. We will be talking at length about having an assessment that is multifactored, that is comprehensive, that includes a variety of different professionals, and looks at a variety of different areas that are relevant to the student. When we are selecting tools for assessment in special education, it's important that they are technically sound, meaning they do what they are supposed to do and they do that consistently. Tests that are considered reliable are tests that are consistent. It means that if we administer the same assessment over and over again, we should get the same results. We know that we can trust it, we know that it is reliable, that it is a consistent instrument. The validity of a test refers to whether or not the test measures what it is intended to measure. We can have a test that is reliable but that is not valid, meaning that it could be incorrect but produce reliable results. However, it's impossible to have a test that's valid and not be reliable. So if a test is valid and it's actually measuring what it's intending to measure, it should be also reliable, meaning that you should get consistent results over time. So it is possible to have reliability without validity. However, validity also comes along with reliability. Tests must be administered by trained and qualified professionals. So the tests that are administered for special education do require specific training in the administration, the scoring, and the interpretation of the results that we obtain. There is a fair amount of policy and procedure that is necessary for us to understand throughout the process of a special education evaluation. The first being that parents must be notified that their child has been referred or that there are concerns that their child might have a disability. We typically make parents aware of this through the prior written notice form, which is Ohio Required Form PRO1. This is the form that we fill out. My motto with the PRO1 form is when in doubt, fill it out. This is really the form that we use to document anything that goes on in special education and the form that we use to respond to any type of parent request or parent concern. But one of the functions of that form is to notify the parent that their child is suspected of having a disability and has been referred for a special education evaluation. Prior to conducting any evaluation, we have to obtain informed parental consent. So we have to make sure that the parent understands that the child has been referred, that we have concerns that they may have a disability, and that they understand the evaluation process and provide their informed consent before we conduct any direct assessment. We must conduct assessment prior to special education eligibility. It's not something that you can simply sign up for or simply place a child into special education. The eligibility for special education comes after a comprehensive and multi-factored evaluation has occurred, and the evaluation team has met and agreed that the child is eligible for special ed. Once students are in special education, it is required that we evaluate their progress regularly. Parents also may view their school records at any time, and parents have a right to an explanation of all test results. So it's important that, we, in addition to getting informed consent, also make sure that we explain test results to parents in a way that they can easily understand what the tests mean and what are the implications for the child's instruction. And we will spend a good amount of time this semester at our IEP or ETR workshop nights working on explaining test results to parents so that we understand them well ourselves and can communicate their results effectively to others. When we talked about choosing effective or appropriate tests, one of the things that we have to do is evaluate whether or not the instruments that we are using are appropriate, whether they are technically sound. Really, the gold standard for evaluating the effectiveness of tests are professional peer reviewed journals. This is really the best source of gathering an unbiased view of the test's reliability and validity. It's not considered sufficient to rely solely on the testing manufacturer's review of their own tests for obvious reasons. Um, the testing manufacturer, however, is considered the best source of information about the development of the test. So, how the test was normed, the administration guidelines, any of those particulars, we really would defer to the expertise of the testing manufacturer. However, when it comes to the technical soundness of the instrument, we really rely on professional peer reviewed journals as the best source of information there. There are many different types of assessments for us to choose from. This, again, is one of the themes that we will reiterate throughout the semester. Um, every tool must be related to the evaluation question, and we have a variety of different strategies that are available to us. So, we spoke on the first night of class about how assessment is a very broad term. We're not simply just talking about standardized tests. So, norm referenced or standardized tests are certainly one thing that we have at our disposal to use during the special ed evaluation process, but we also have other things available to us, including observations, informal inventories, checklists, interviews, things of that nature. So it doesn't just have to be a standardized norm reference test, although that is one thing that is available to us. When considering whether or not an assessment is appropriate or considering which assessment we should choose to answer a specific referral question, we want to consider if the student matches the norm group of the test, meaning we want to know as much as we can about the norm group or the standard of reference that that test utilized, because we will be comparing our student and their achievement on that test against the performance and the achievement of the student in the norm group. This is particularly relevant when we are talking about students who might have a low incidence disability or students who might be atypical in some way, meaning they might be an English language learner, there might be other cultural considerations, there might be socioeconomic differences between the student that we are working with and the students included in the norm group. So, anytime we have a student that, for whatever reason, represents a huge outlier to the students that were included in the norm group, it might not be appropriate to choose that test for the student. We also want to consider the age of the student. We really approach things very differently with preschool students than we do with high schoolers, for instance, and we'll talk about a little bit more of the differences between those, but that's definitely something to consider, is how old the student is. The mode of presentation and the mode of response. So, how things are presented to the student versus, in terms of does it require visual? Does it require auditory input? Same thing with their responses. Again, these are particularly relevant questions or considerations when we're dealing with students who have more low incidence disabilities. We also want to look at time factors, and that goes along with whether it's a group administration or an individual administration as well. We've touched a little bit on the technical quality or the technical adequacy of the instruments that we use. The adequacy of an assessment tool as a measurement device, we're talking about the reliability, the validity, the measurement error, and the reference group or the standard. Definitely read over these sections in your text. They go into, a lot more depth about what each of these constructs are and about some considerations that we should take into account in each of these areas when we are evaluating the technical quality of an instrument. So definitely refer back to the text for a more elaborate explanation of these constructs. There are four types of measurement scales that we're going to discuss. They're called nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. A nominal scale simply divides the subtests into categories. There aren't any values necessarily assigned to the categories, so no numbers, no quantities. So, for example, if we would divide up a classroom into students with brown hair or students with blonde hair, we could also divide up the class in students who have dogs versus students who have cats, those types of things. Um, no numbers, no values, just names, just uh, information such as that. I always think of nominal names, labels, that type of thing. That is how we sort and divide data or people within a nominal scale. The ordinal scale divides participants or divides data into an arrangement based on a sequence. For instance, if we would place individuals into position relative one another, like first, second, or third. The thing about an ordinal scale is that we don't know anything about the distance between the individuals. For instance, we could order students based on their achievement on a spelling test. There might be only 1 point difference between the student in first place and the student in second place. However, there might be 5 points that separate the second place and the third place individual. So we know who was first, second, third, and so on, but we don't know anything about the relative position or the distance per se between the individuals, and it could be, quite variable in this type of a scale. An interval scale has all of those qualities that we just talked about in the previous measurement scale, but in this type of a scale, there's also equal intervals between units. So individuals are not only ordered, but the distance between their scores can also be discussed. So these scales don't begin with a true zero, however, the starting point is just arbitrary. So for instance, if you get a 0 on a quiz or a 0 on the exam, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't know anything. It just means that you weren't able to answer any of the questions on that test, but it doesn't mean that you don't have any knowledge. So the key to remember here is that the individuals are ordered as they were in the ordinal scale. However, the distance between the scores can be discussed and it is known in this type of scale. The key to remember here, though, is that the starting point is arbitrary, and when we get a 0 on an interval scale, we're not talking about an absolute 0. We're not talking about nothing in this type of a measurement scale. A ratio scale is what we will be talking about most often in special education. This is a scale that begins with a true 0. It has equal intervals between the units, and this allows us to perform operations and calculations with the numbers. This is where statistics really comes in. Often physical properties use ratio scales like height and weight, where when you get a 0 on the scale, that truly means that that item has no mass. When we get a height of 0, that truly means that something, is non-existent. It's not there. So a 0 on this scale is a true 0. A 0 on this scale truly means an absence of everything. There are some descriptive statistics that we utilize a lot when we talk about the validity or the technical adequacy of assessments. These should be pretty familiar to all of you. The mean, median, and mode, just make sure that you refresh your memory on what each of these means. You won't be required to calculate these at all, but just be familiar with the benefits and limitations of each one of these descriptive statistics as well as what they are. The next statistical property that we're going to discuss is a couple of different measures of variability. The first measure of variability that we're going to talk about is the area of range. This describes the scatter or the span involved in the data that we have, or the distance between the highest and the lowest scores. Standard deviation is a statistical property that talks about the variability as well in a set of scores or in a set of data, and it specifically takes each score's relationship to the mean or the middle score into account. This is great for use with interval data scales. Probably the most relevant for our purposes would include results obtained on standardized norm reference tests. We'll talk a lot about standard deviation in that context later on in the semester, but standard deviation is very helpful for us in communicating results on those tests to parents, to teachers, and for understanding students' achievement ourselves to develop good educational programs. Here are some other measures of variability. I would really encourage you to look in the text for a more in-depth description of these areas. Mainly just know what the Pearson R coefficient is, but basically this is a statistical property that allows us to, in our purposes particularly, look at the effectiveness or the technical adequacy of a test or assessment that we might be deciding to use. So a coefficient of 0 shows no relationship. A coefficient of +1 shows a perfect positive correlation. A coefficient of -1 shows a negative correlation. So for our purposes, when we are evaluating tests and assessments for use in special education, we want to look for a coefficient that's as close to +1 as we can get. We really often don't see a +1 exactly, but we're looking for things that are 0.89, 0.90, 0.93, things in that range would give us an idea that the test or the assessment that we're considering is reliable, is valid, and would be an appropriate test for us to use in the special education process. So that's really the takeaway that I want you to have, but definitely reflect back to the text for a more in-depth explanation of the Pearson R and all of the measures of variability as well. The technical adequacy of an instrument is something obviously that's very important for us to consider. I'm going to again refer you to the text as it provides a much more in-depth description of these types of measures, but just be aware of what we're looking for in terms of saying that a test is reliable, that it's valid, and that it meets the standards of technical adequacy. It is very important that we choose tests and instruments that meet certain standards so that we can know that we're using an effective and appropriate measure to assess students' achievement in any type of area that relates to our referral question. Okay, norm groups and standards. These are very relevant specifically to tests that we're going to learn about this semester, like the KTEA or the Wyatt. Standardized norm reference tests are tests that compare an individual's performance to that in the norm group. So when we test a student and work with them individually, that test will yield a result or a score, and that allows us to compare the child's performance on that evaluation to all of the individuals who were included in that norm group. It's important that the norm group that was used by the test manufacturer is comprehensive. The gold standard really is that the norm group would be based in terms of cultural and ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds included in the individuals in the norm group to the most recent U.S. Census. So that's really the gold standard, is that the manufacturer match the norm group to the U.S. Census. And it's also relevant for us to consider the student that we are working with to see if students like that are represented anywhere in the norm group that was utilized by the test manufacturer. Again, I'll refer you back to the text for a more in-depth description of the considerations that we should look into when we are selecting norm reference tests and when we are evaluating whether or not the test manufacturer used a norm group that is relevant to the student with whom we are working. So definitely refer back to your text regarding the norm reference test considerations. Criterion reference tests just vary slightly from the standardized norm reference test that we were speaking of earlier. These tests either are formally designed, meaning that they're published by a test manufacturer like the KTEA or the Wyatt, or they could even be more informally designed curriculum based measures. So there's a little bit more variability in what these tests look like, meaning are they published packages of tests that we can purchase, or we could be talking also about informally designed curriculum based assessment here as well. So instead of comparing a student's performance against a normative group and comparing this child's achievement to the achievement of all students in the norm group, a criterion reference test will be comparing the child's performance against a standard. Particularly for our purposes, we're usually comparing the child against a curriculum standard. So we're saying that they meet or don't meet a specific criteria, they have mastered or not mastered a specific skill. We're not really comparing them against the performance of other students per se, but we're comparing them against a curriculum standard and saying they have met or not met a specific cutoff that's relevant to the curriculum. For instance, we might be looking at students who passed or failed a Ohio Achievement Assessment, for instance. So instead of looking at the child's individual scores on those tests, we would be saying, did they meet the cutoff of 400 or not? We might be looking at students who could read more than 100 words correct per minute, looking at a student who passed a formative assessment. So we're looking at a specific standard, a specific cutoff, a specific criterion, and saying the child has or has not met that standard. We've talked a little bit about reliability and validity. This talks about those in the context of the Pearson R coefficient. So again, make sure that you understand these points as they are outlined in the text. Make sure that you have an overall understanding of the fact that reliability refers to the consistency of a test or the test retest reliability. A good test should at least have a correlation of 0.80 to be considered reliable. A correlation of 0.90 or higher is typically considered necessary to make high stakes decisions, like deciding if a child is eligible for special education or not. We really want to use tests that have a very high rating of reliability for those purposes. Validity, again, talks about whether or not a test measures what it is supposed to measure, and no measure can be considered valid if it's not reliable. So remember, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, it is possible for a test to be reliable, but it be invalid, meaning that it can yield consistent but incorrect results over time. However, if a test is actually valid and it is measuring what it is intending to measure, it will by nature also be reliable. The standard error of measurement is something that we will talk about more at length when we learn to give the KTEA and the Wyatt this semester. But this is a statistical quality that is inherent anytime we administer a standardized assessment to a student. The result that we get on that administration will give us a very good, very accurate estimate of a student's ability. However, we can't say for sure that we got a score that encapsulates their entire achievement or their entire ability in that one assessment. Because we're dealing with humans and because we're dealing with a lot of ups and downs and different things, there will always be some standard of error inherent in our assessment. To communicate the standard of error, we talk about what's considered a confidence interval when we report scores. For instance, a student might get a standard score of 100 on an assessment, and the confidence interval for that score may be something like 94 to 103. What that means is when we report out a confidence interval, say we report out a confidence level of 95%. That means that 95 out of 100 times, if we were to administer the same assessment to this student, 95 out of the 100 times, we would anticipate the child's score would fall within the range of 94 to 103. So in this example here at the bottom, we're talking about the 95% confidence interval for Sarah. So Sarah earned a standard score of 99 on the test that we gave her. On this particular administration, the confidence interval for that is 94 to 103. So that means that if we tested Sarah 100 times, 95 out of that 100 times, we can be sure she would earn a score between the range of 94 to 103. She might not always get a 99 like she did on this administration, but we can be pretty sure that her score falls within that narrow window of achievement. This slide talks a little bit about informal measures of assessment. Remember how we talked about assessment as a very broad construct, and it's even much more broad than just standardized norm reference tests. This slide talks a little bit about some more informal, curriculum-based or observational interviews, checklists, things like that that we can generate more at a grassroots level, and talks about where they would fall in terms of being nominal, ordinal, or ratio scales. When we do administered standardized norm reference tests, we get a couple of different kinds of scores from those tests. The first score that we get is what's considered the raw score. The raw score is simply the number of test items that are answered correctly, but we have to take that score and do some calculation with that to convert that to a standard score. The standard score is what will allow us to really talk about that student's achievement in relation to everyone else in the norm group. So we're not just talking about a raw score like we would on a criterion referenced assessment or a curriculum-based assessment, but we really need to go a step further and convert that raw score, convert that number of items or number of questions that the student answered correctly into a standard score. So definitely be aware that we have to perform that calculation, and we'll spend time at length learning how to do that when we go over the KTEA and the Wyatt administration in class. So just for this purpose, be aware that the raw score must be converted to a standard score in order for us to communicate about results on norm reference tests. One of the ways that we do that calculation and things that are relevant when we're considering that calculation are age or grade equivalents. So this allows us to compare the individual's performance, or the student that we're working with, allows us to compare his or her performance with the performance of other students in the norm group. Most test publishers provide two different standards or two different groups for us to consider. The first one is an age equivalent, and the second one is a grade equivalent. So they'll provide norms based on the child's age, where we can compare that child to other students of the exact same age, or we can compare that child to students who are in the same grade. For instance, if we're working with a student that is 8 years, 5 months old, we could compare that student to all other children who are 8 years, 5 months old, or we could compare that student to the grade level to which they're assigned. Most 8-year-olds are in, say, second grade. We could compare that child to all other students in the second grade. The gold standard of comparison really is considered the child's same age peers. Comparing students to all other children of the same grade is a little bit more broad. There are obviously students of a variety of ages in the second grade or the fifth grade, or whatever grade we're talking about. There's a little bit more variability in terms of the ages of students. So the gold standard for most cases is that we compare students against other children of the same age. So the age-based norm is considered to be the gold standard. However, there are some circumstances where that's not considered the most appropriate. For instance, when we have a student who is not a typical age for the grade that they are in. For instance, if a child has been accelerated or if a child has been retained. If we have a child who's been retained, we might have a child who is 9 years and 5 months old who is attending the second grade because they were held back for whatever reason. In that kind of a circumstance, that child who's 9.5 years old would not have the same exposure to the curriculum as most 9.5-year-old students. So most kids who are 9.5 across the country would probably be in the third grade and would be exposed to third grade concepts and curriculum, and therefore might perform a little bit differently on that test of achievement than our student who's 9.5 years old but was retained and is in the second grade. So whenever the child is not of a typical age for the grade level that they are participating in at the time, it often becomes necessary and in those cases is more appropriate to use the grade-based norm. If there aren't any extenuating circumstances, it's considered most effective and most appropriate to use the age-based norm. Norm reference test scores also provide a percentile rank. Again, this is another way that we can describe the student's performance in relation to other students and their achievement. We'll talk about this at length and what percentile rank means in terms of a student's performance relative to their peers and how to communicate that effectively to others when we do our ETR and IEP workshops. The standard score, again, transfers that raw score, as I mentioned, to a new scale, and that scale has a set mean and a new standard deviation. So the standard score allows us to take the amount of questions the student answered correctly and transfer that to a new scale in which we can talk about a mean and a standard deviation. For our purposes, the standardized tests all have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So that means that students who achieve scores within the range of 85 to 115 are considered to be within one standard deviation of the mean, and most students will earn scores within that range. So that's really kind of considered our average range of performance or our average range of achievement on the kind of test that we will be working with. Chapter 4 talks about actually administering assessments and some things that are key to know as an administrator of these standardized norm reference tests. The first thing is considering preparation of the tester. Testers must have supervised practice and receive feedback about their test administration. We will certainly be beginning the process of teaching you how to administer these assessments in our course. However, as I mentioned on the first night, it really is not appropriate for you to communicate any results that are obtained in this administration of the assessment because you are still learning and because you're not considered a proficient tester at the current time. To administer these assessments and be able to communicate accurate and reliable results, we would need much more practice and feedback than you would get in the scope of this class. So we're really giving you an introduction, but it would require a lot more practice and guided feedback if you were going to administer this in a real evaluation. Typically, we would include multiple supervised practice opportunities. It's important to only administer tests that you're qualified to give. So if you've never had any training or any supervision in the administration of an assessment, it would be within your ethical responsibility to indicate that to your supervisor and say, I've never done this before. I really would need to seek additional training before I can administer this in a professional context. As an intervention specialist or a general education teacher, it is typical for you to obtain training eventually that would allow you to administer achievement tests looking at a student's reading, math, and writing achievement. However, cognitive or IQ tests looking at a student's learning and their cognitive ability are typically only administered by a licensed psychologist or a licensed school psychologist. So the administration and interpretation of cognitive or IQ tests is specific to the practice of psychology. These things about the testing environment really are pretty obvious, but we just want to make sure that we provide an environment and a testing situation that allows students to elicit their best performance. So you don't want to administer these types of tests in an area where there's an audience, in an area where there are a lot of distractions, where it's noisy and you can't hear the students' responses. You don't want things that are diverting the child's attention. You just want to be cognizant of the testing environment. You want to make sure as the the tester or as the administrator of these tests that you know what you're doing, that you have all the materials that you need right there at hand. You don't waste a lot of time going back and forth and gathering things that you need. You're not wasting a lot of time shuffling through your materials or reading your directions. So the administration of these tests does take quite a bit of preparation ahead of time for you to have your ducks in a row and be able to give your full attention to the administration of the test and to really focus on the child and their responses and recording what they say throughout the evaluation. Establishing rapport with students is technically defined as preparing a student psychologically for testing. Really, what that means is just that you develop some type of relationship with the student and establish some level of comfortability with them before beginning the test procedures. These can just include things like brief introductions, brief conversation with the student, playing a game with them, asking them some questions, giving them an opportunity to ask you any questions that they have, or clear up any concerns or worries that they might have about what's going on. Giving them a brief overview of what's going to happen. This obviously is very dependent on the child's age and their developmental level, how much you get into that and how much you share with them. But just giving them a brief synopsis of what's going to be happening, what they can expect, letting them know a little bit about who you are and what you hope to accomplish in the session. When you explain testing to students, it's really nice to just put them at ease as much as possible. We really want to alleviate anxiety so that students aren't kind of frozen or really inhibited by worry or fear during the assessment process, because that obviously affects the results that we get and affects their ability to give their best performance. I really always try to focus on the fact that the testing session is an opportunity to work together. I don't tell the student that it's just a playtime, because again, we want them to know that although it's something not to be stressed out and worried over, it is a situation where we do expect them to work hard and give their best performance. So don't focus on it as a playtime, focus on it as a time to learn more about the student. Focus on the fact that it's a time to get more information about how the child learns and what information they know, how to help them at school. Those are some of the phrases that I commonly use when I'm explaining tests to kids, especially young kids. Briefly describe the activities that will take place. You can just go over this in a broad sense. Talk about, we're going to be doing some reading together. We're going to be doing some counting. We're going to be doing some math problems. Just giving them a brief overview in simple terms that are understandable about what they can expect. Chronological age is a figure that we will calculate that allows us to calculate the exact number of years, months, and days since the child's birth. This is what we use when we make that calculation of the student's raw score that I mentioned to the standard score that allows us to put it on that standard scale that has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, and allows us to compare the child to their same age peers. So this allows us to calculate the child's exact age and therefore allows us to compare the child's achievement with the achievement of all students in their age group. So we'll talk about this a little bit more and go over specifically how to perform this calculation when we go over the administration of the assessments in class. But just be aware that the chronological age is the exact number of years, months, and days since the child was born, and we calculate that in order to know what set of standards to compare the child against in their age group.